Welcome, everyone. My name is Stephen Curley. I'm a member of the Federation of State Boards of Physical Therapy Board of Directors. We at FSBPT and the board want to welcome you to another regulatory hour. FSBPT is focused on providing educational content on key issues impacting regulation. Regulatory hours are presented every other month, and the next regulatory hour is coming in April and will focus on board efficiencies. FSBPT also has two other webinars coming up in the next month. On February 25th, the Council of Board Administrators, or CBA, is having a webinar focusing on the Service Member Civil Relief Act and how it relates to boards. As a reminder, the CBA webinar is for board administrators and staff. The other webinar will be on March 6th and will focus on communication. More details are coming soon, so please be on the lookout. Today's regulatory hour is again presented as usual by Dale Atkinson and is regarding board audits. Don't let your board ride off into the sunset. This session will address regulatory board audits, their processes, and provide an analysis on how important it is to always be prepared. This webinar is being recorded. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dale.
Stephen, thank you so much, and welcome to February 2025 Regulatory Hour. I do want to begin, as I always do, by a big, hearty, and sincere thank you to each and every one of you. So one is thanks to the FSBPT Board of Directors for all it does for your organization, including hosting these webinars. Two is thanks to the staff, FSBPT staff, Rich and Jeff and the whole crew behind the scenes that operationalize and make these happen. So a big shout out, thanks. And then the biggest thanks goes to each and every one of you who's on the line today, no matter what role you play, board member, exec, administrator, staff of a board, a member board, and or assistant attorney general or others. The role you play is so important. So a big recognition, thank you from me to each and every one of you. You're used to hearing me probably say this if you've attended these, but again, I like to emphasize that every chance that I get, because you're not thanked enough and you should be. So we have kind of a ride off into the sunset theme, as you can see there from my thank you little card there, as well as this picture. But I'm Dale Atkinson. I'm an attorney, and I represent a whole bunch of FSBPT-like organizations, and I'm always just thrilled and honored to be a part of your webinars, FSBPT's webinars. And so I bring my perspective of representing, again, several FSBPT-like organizations, so I hope it's helpful to you. And a special shout out, welcome to Amy Richardson, who's on the line today, and she's also from my office. So I do want to recognize that's the perspective I bring to the table, and my entire 38-year career practicing has been representing groups like yours. So appreciate it. Thank you for having me. We do want you to participate. So that means you can unmute and speak, you can chat, you can raise your hand. Rich and Jeff, keep an eye on the attendees. I can see some of you, but not many of you. But feel free to interrupt me, Rich, Jeff, or any of the attendees if you have a comment or a question. I particularly like this and chose this Western-themed Far Side because I had this actual one on my refrigerator for years. I'm a piano player and a blues harmonica player, so I found this to be humorous, and so hopefully you all do as well. But please feel free to chat and to make sure, or to participate, and to make sure that you're listening, you know what you're doing here. Chat something into the type something into the chats now just to say hi to your fellow attendees. Or you can put in your favorite hockey team, your NHL hockey team, or you can describe, or you can predict who's going to win tomorrow night's championship Four Nations Cup game. So there's some hellos there and greetings from Washington. So a big welcome to all of you. If you could, for my benefit as well as others too, if you have a chance and you want to put your jurisdiction next to your name, that might be helpful, certainly to me, but I think most of you maybe know each other, but if you do get a chance, you could put that in there. So snowy North Carolina, excellent, excellent. Snow is a good thing, at least in my world. So we welcome water and snow. So USA. All right, good. So we're in the hockey spirit, we're in the chatting spirit, we're in the participating spirit as well. And so let's talk a little bit about this topic and why at least I chose it, why I think is very, very worthy. And it is probably one of the most important, perhaps overlooked topics, I believe, as well. So it's cold in Minnesota, it's chilly in Chicago, excellent, and it's snowing in Kentucky. So we've got winter going on, and maybe that's a good thing. So So back to the topic now. Perhaps a topic that is I don't want to say overlooked, but maybe we don't pay enough attention to it. And I think by the time these slides are done and my remarks are done and your remarks and reactions are done, hopefully we have a better handle on what it actually means to be a board itself. And I think some of the things I say today will be quite repetitive from past webinars and from in-person presentations I do for lots of different groups, but it is truly worthy of repeating. And so look at the kind of climate we're in right now politically. And you can start with the federal government, and obviously things are happening and there's scrutiny on government. I might suggest that regulatory boards should not only welcome the scrutiny, but invite the scrutiny. And you do it with confidence. And again, by the time these slides are done, I'm hoping there's some ideas of one, not to be fearful of scrutiny, but also to invite it because you are confident in the roles that you play and otherwise. But so the political climate, both federally and probably within each of your jurisdictions, varies a bit, but there's a lot of scrutiny now on government, and perhaps rightfully so, but welcome it. The status and future of regulation perhaps is at stake here. Don't want to be overly dramatic about it, but regulation, deregulation, modifying regulation, consolidation of boards, all these issues are on the table. And how prepared are we, you, regulatory board members and staff, how prepared are you to address that? What's working and what's not working? More importantly, that what is not working. You should welcome again this kind of scrutiny, to be repetitive here. But how do we know? How do we know how? And the phrase that I use, how efficient and effective you are as a regulatory board. It is not an easy standard to meet, but I think if you read your sunset statutes or otherwise, and we'll get into that in just a minute, but if you read those, you'll understand that the legislature is asking, please verify or justify your continued existence. And how are you going to do that? And that's a very difficult standard to meet, but we're setting the stage now for today's topic of audits, sunsets, and reactions by your board. Now, I do want to acknowledge as well is that what is within your control and what is not within your control, I understand that. And so for some of you who may be a standalone board, you may have much more control over issues related to your operational side, to your outreach side and website presence, to your social media presence or otherwise. And you may have more, you standalone boards may have more of an opportunity to address the issues that I will raise, as opposed to, say, departmentalized jurisdictions where a board may be part of a larger department of professional regulation. And then those composite boards that exist in between, multiple professions being regulated by, if you will, one mini umbrella board itself. So I acknowledge that some of these issues are not within your control of ultimate conclusions. However, I think everything I talk about today will be within your control as to the management of the operations of the board itself, the recognition of the why the board exists, and the ability to record keep and do outreach to whomever you decide that outreach is appropriate, whether it be applicants, licensees, whether it be consumers and public, whether it be the legislature and or subcommittees of the legislature, whatever it might be. And so again, acknowledgement of some things are outside of your control, but grab what is within your control and make the best of it as you possibly can. And here I am also going to take the time to recognize the volunteerism that is involved in professional regulation. And that you all are volunteers not only to your jurisdictional state boards, but you're volunteers to your assistants to FSBPT and your contributions there. So one, a big shout out, thanks. And then two is a recognition of what's expected of volunteers and otherwise. So acknowledgement and understanding that as well. And I've kind of already defined this and decided, but if anybody would like to just go ahead and submit a chat right now, where do you think your board is? Are you a standalone? Are you a composite? Are you departmentalized? You could put other in there if I'm not describing every possibility there, but it's always nice to gather some data, again, because the FSBPT recognition approach may be driven by, in part, by the makeup of its membership. So I can see a couple of standalones coming in here, and there may be others. So Rich and Jeff, feel free to take advantage of some of this knowledge here that's coming through there. So now let's talk about what is within your control. And here's what we're going to hopefully to address. And in part, the self-evaluation is certainly within your control. Executive branch actions, resolutions, statutory changes are all the issues that surface when it comes to audits, sunset review, reports, or otherwise. And so I'll say this again, but I'm going to say this now as I pause, and that is always be ready for sunset or audits, whatever they're called in your jurisdiction, whether they apply to you or not statutorily. Always be prepared. And I'm a big advocate of significant record keeping, if you will, robust minutes and data that is at your fingertips at all times, whether you're a board member or staff, so that you can continue to self-evaluate and justify your existence, even if you're not asked to justify your existence. We cannot, in today's climate, take anything for granted. So we'll go through these singularly, but I wanted to at least set the stage for some of this as well. And so starting with self-evaluation, do you do self-evaluations as a board? How often do you do this? Do you do it at the end of every single board meeting? How did we do? What went well? What didn't go well? Who's here? Who's not? Do we have any vacancies? Whatever the issues might be confronting your boards, the agenda development, the participation of the board members, the leadership, the presiding officer, critical issues, and how is it working for you? And you need to ask that. You won't know if you don't ask. And so I would advocate for some kind of a self-evaluation of perhaps at the end of every board meeting. You may not even meet that often, quarterly versus monthly versus whatever. And so don't ignore the opportunities to self-evaluate so that you, as a board, as a state board, as a member board of FSBPT, can determine, well, how are we doing? And how are we not doing? And you determine that by the satisfaction of those that are in attendance, whether they be board members or not. And so feel free to type in the chats. Yeah, we do self-evaluations regularly, or we don't do them at all ever. Whatever it is, as long as you're willing to say it out loud publicly, feel free to put that into that chat. And the reason I'm emphasizing, by the way, chats, and I do this a lot, and that is to tell your fellow attendees, this isn't about speaking with me, you're speaking with your fellow attendees who are other regulators. This works for us, and this doesn't work for us. Here's what we do. And so using the FSBPT bar annually and others. So these opportunities exist. Please take advantage of them. Now, part of a self-evaluation for me, and admittedly, I'm way into this because I do a significant amount of board member training for my clients, and including your regulatory workshop that is coming up. So plug for the regulatory workshop. Contact Rich or Jeff about information related to that. But, and that is an understanding of government regulation. I might suggest to you, and by the way, what I'm about to ask is not an easy question. It may sound like an easy question, but do you really understand what government regulation is all about? And maybe more importantly, I should have put it on this slide, is why? Why does government regulate? We all, and I include myself in this, we need to be way better at understanding and then ultimately articulating the basis for government regulation. If we don't understand that, it becomes very difficult to address an audit and or sunset process or annual report that you may do, which you should do, by the way. But if we don't understand the why part of government, it becomes that much more difficult to address issues that the legislatures need to hear and should be asking. And again, I'm going to further admit too, the legislatures do what the legislatures do, and it doesn't always make sense to us in the regulatory community, but we do need to learn to think like and articulate to legislative bodies the why and how and what of government regulation. You certainly need to understand yourself and what role you play as an appointed board member, state board member, as a hired staff, as an executive director, administrator, investigator, inspector, whatever it is. You need to understand yourself and, again, at times be able to articulate that when necessary, understanding that the board speaks with one voice and you should have communication protocols. I understand that. However, what role do you play individually? And you understand that, and can you articulate that? And then lastly, there, of course, is it's a group decision-making process. The board speaks with one voice, it makes decisions. Some of them are easier than others, some are extremely difficult, and you're under a lot of pressure at times, both politically and from public or consumers or licensees or their lawyers at all times. So this whole self-evaluation, I think, needs to be documented. And so to the extent that your staff can create some kind of a survey instrument that you're going to periodically use, however often you decide, is going to help you figure out how to document that so you can address the audits that might surface or the sunset reports that are sunset reviews that are set forth in the statute itself. So perhaps enough of that, but did I see so board meeting assessment after each meeting and standard performance? Excellent. And so Oregon, you know, we can learn from Oregon. They're saying this. Does anyone else do self-regulation issues? And I'm sorry, I'm going to scroll up a little bit on these chats. So Jerry, what jurisdiction is that? So maybe you could type that in there as well. So let's learn from each other, take advantage of these opportunities about the issues we talk about, including self-regulation. Or self-evaluation, self-regulation, topic in and of itself. And then lastly, here on the self-evaluation, what's the board's role? What's the board member's role? Do you do outreach? And what do I mean by outreach? Well, anything you can think of. It could be website pushing out, it could be social media pushing out information. It could be website having information accessible to. It could be surveys of your applicants, surveys of your licensees, perhaps surveys of whom you think is relevant and important to weigh in on these issues. So you will see when we get to the California report that I'll reference and others, some jurisdictions are surveying their licensees constantly to ensure that licensees are in the know, but so is the board. And you get information from them about satisfaction of the board operations side, satisfaction of the application and renewal process, satisfaction of the complaint process, which could come from consumers and or licensees who may be subjected to the process of an adverse action. So outreach is absolutely critical, and probably across the professions I work with, this is where boards might be the weakest. You all are smart people. Most of you are licensees, but there's public members as well. But how often do we have to engage in this type of outreach and surveying instruments? Get advice from your lawyers, by the way, when you're creating a survey, and make sure that you are phrasing the questions perhaps in a manner that will not only garner the information you need, but meet the requirements of the law, specifically say disabilities laws or otherwise. Understanding of the law and of course the legislative process. You are animals of the legislature. You exist because of legislation, and you cannot exist because of new legislation. Or you could have your process modified through a consolidation and or departmentalization of the regulatory process. So understand the legislative process, and spending a little bit of time on this topic, and this is a topic worthy of itself alone, but that is, what role does the board play in the legislative process? And the sunset reports that I reviewed in preparing for today's remarks, I thought made some interesting comments related to the board's ability, or more importantly, inability to engage in the legislative process. And again, topic for another day, but lobbying. Most of your boards cannot lobby, but that does not preclude you from being an information source to the legislature. And I've been recommending to my clients of late now, most all of my clients have a model act, as does FSBPT, by the way, so take advantage of your model act. But I've been recommending that adding to the model acts something along the lines that says material amendments to this practice act. So you all know what a practice act is, created you authorize you to act, and you then enforce that practice act in the interest of public protection through a licensure system. That any material modifications to that practice act must be brought to the board for comment prior to enactment. Nothing wrong with that, by the way. And if I were the legislature, I would want to know what you're thinking. You all are the experts. You're there for a reason. And we need to know if this is a good or bad idea, these amendments that we are proposing or suggesting. The legislature doesn't have to follow what you all think, but it's worthy of asking that question to gain the to acquire the relationship between executive branch agencies or boards like you all and the legislative branch, which is enacting laws that affect the profession that you're the experts in. So let's hope that these processes can be that you can have an engaging process with the legislature without having it be called lobbying, which is going to be likely prohibited in most jurisdictions. So these are all such important points, I think, for the existence of the board and the justification of it. And I thought that was my last self-evaluation slide, but I do have another slide. And I added a lot more slides this morning as I was thinking about everything I wanted to say. So delegation, okay, what's delegation? Well, first off, delegation is what the legislature engaged in by enacting a law that created a board that authorized the board to act and gave authority to that board itself, right? But you all as a board can delegate. You can delegate to staff. Well, what happens in between board meetings? What can staff do? And more importantly, what can staff not do? All of this is related to the effectiveness and efficiencies of boards, right? So if applicants are disgruntled by a time period, a passage of time in the application completion and the ultimate issuance of the license, the legislatures are going to hear about that. And when the legislator hears about it, sometimes they act and slash and react in a manner that may not fit the needs of the public served. It may not fit the needs of the operational aspects or the staffing side of regulatory boards. So there's so much to be had there. So those applications and renewals, how often do you meet? Do you meet? Is it often enough? How long do those meetings last? And I'll tell you, in doing a lot of research for all of my clients related to talks that I give, like this one, sometimes I'm amazed at how less often boards meet, regulatory boards meet. And then when I go to the minutes and look at their minutes, it's hard for me reading minutes of a board to really believe that those minutes captured all the important issues the board addresses. And those that are not involved in your board meetings, like legislators, will look at it that way, say you only meet 4 times a year and this is all you do. Why do we regulate? I mean, that question is legitimately being asked. And again, this is back to we need to have answers for that as well. So meetings, minutes, staffing, complaints and adjudication, all of these are so relevant to the effectiveness and efficiencies of the boards themselves. And as part of your surveys, as part of your self-evaluations or anything else, you can gather information on all of these topics and then make it part of a report. And so I don't forget to say it, I'll say it now and say it again later. And that is whether you're under a sunset review or whether you're under an audit process or anything else that might exist, even if you're not under those processes, I strongly suggest you do annual reports anyway, and you submit those to the executive branch of government and perhaps the legislative branch as well to tell the world what you do, why you do it, and how effective and efficient you are at doing it. It is time well spent, and it may avoid some of the political pitfalls that are out there currently now and perhaps into the future. So take advantage of these opportunities, even if you're not asked to do so by a sunset statute or a specific request for an audit. So, so now, what's next? Executive branch actions, right? Okay. So you know that you are part of the executive branch, although you were created through the enactment of a law and delegated with authority, you fall under the executive branch of government. Hence why the appointment process and perhaps other issues that surface, but you need to know that and you need to understand the the consequences of that. You serve at the pleasure of the governor or the appointing authority, and you can be replaced and removed, and it happens all the time. And that Cuban case that's listed there, and that should say 2025. It says 2024. My apologies. It was decided in last month in January in a Wyoming federal district court. Very, very short version of this case. There's a lot going on it, but it is a medical board governor appointed person who on an individual basis chose to write to the legislature, to all of the House of Representatives, and speak in opposition or in favor of. I might have these backwards, but speak related to legislation that was being considered. Okay. In that correspondence to the House of Representatives, this board member of the medical board, who is also a licensee, of course, named names of the trade association people and other doctors who were on the opposite side of the fence as to what the position Dr. Cuban was taking. So names are now being named, and they're being put forth in a opinion-driven correspondence to all of the folks in the House of Representatives. Well, eventually, the governor of Wyoming removed the board member based on conflict of interest principles. You've named people; these people may come before the board in a complaint setting or an adverse action, or I might suggest, the court didn't say this, by the way, but I might suggest will come before the board at least on a renewal basis of licensure. So the governor determined that the perception of conflict, the naming of names, and otherwise was a reason that there's an irreconcilable conflict that exists, and removed this person from the medical board. Okay. Believe it or not, and I think this is one of the first times I've seen a case like this, the person challenged this decision and is somehow arguing that they have a right to be on that board. There's a lot of legal arguments that go on to this. But the bottom line to this is this individual argued that First Amendment rights, he had the right to speak freely. There's no conflicts and other principles that exist, and he can handle those on a one-off basis and otherwise. And so this dispute lives on. So the disposition of the case as it stands today is a motion for a preliminary injunction by the plaintiff, Dr. Cuban, was denied by the court. And he was saying, put me back on the board now. And by the way, he's seeking monetary damages because as a board member, he gets paid the same as the legislatures do on a pro rata basis. So just kind of another interesting tidbit of information there. So the preliminary injunction was denied by the courts, no likelihood of success. That's the legal standard. And the governor has sought and has received a stay on discovery because the case lives on, but there's a lot more legal arguments based on immunity and other principles that exist. But this is an interesting case because you all know this, right? You were appointed by the governor, and I think you all would make some kind of an assumption that you could be removed by the governor for really any reason, but for some unlawful reason that might be a protected, class or something, principle. So interesting case. We'll keep an eye on it. But again, that was decided in 2025. Sorry, not 2024. And it raises some very interesting questions. The last issue I'm going to make out of this case here as well, and I don't want to get too far off of topic, but that is the court has ruled already in the motion for a preliminary injunction that the board member is to be treated as a public employee. And I would have never thought that until I read this opinion, that a appointed volunteer board member is treated as a public employee. So I think there's more to come out of this case, and there's some interesting principles to watch and keep our eye on. So apologies for spending too much time there, but again, these are, I think, important concepts to the big picture issues that exist. So next up are resolutions, right? So the legislature can introduce a resolution that expresses the position of the legislative body. Doesn't need to be enacted as a statute or otherwise, and they can be used to express sentiment, form committees like a sunset review or audit committee, and initiate matters related to the operations of the legislative chamber. So a little definition of legislative directive. And I think you will find that some of the audits, and when I use the word audits, by the way, audit, it's not just financial. We'll get to that in a minute, but it's not just financial. So introducing that an audit of a board or of a department or of all the boards should be undertaken. An audit of the regulations that exist and an attempt to clean up those regulations, or a moratorium on, or the red tape reduction issues that we've seen around that say there's too many regulations, some are outdated, please clean it up. Or what we're seeing is for every new regulation, you have to get rid of two other regulations. And, these are such arbitrary, decisions that are made, but the legislature certainly has a right to stimulate that through a legislative direction. The executive branch can issue declarations and proclamations as well about the executive branch agencies like your boards. So those can surface and might surface as well. And kind of the last avenues that we're talking about to address challenges to the status quo are statutory changes. And I've already mentioned this, but deregulation, change in governance, consolidation of boards, for example, consolidation of administrative staff, reducing government and trying to do so in the name of perhaps saving money, creating efficiencies in the operations of the boards themselves, whatever that might be done. It's there. Certainly adjusting the board authority and ideas that exist out there related to that might be that boards only issue and renew licenses, and another agency handles the complaint process and the adjudication of those complaints and otherwise. And then lastly is the prerequisites to licensure. And I asterisk that one because in my world of representing other groups, the ASWB, which is social work, and they are the equivalent of the FSBPT as an organization, meaning they're a nonprofit organization whose members are comprised of the government regulatory boards from the US and Canada actually as well, but the US. And they develop, administer, score, and maintain a uniform licensure exam program, just like you all do. And then they have lots of other programs just like you all do. So what happened recently, in August of 2022, ASWB released a exam score analysis of the performance on their exam program by demographics. These are volunteer-given demographic data, by the way. You can't mandate someone identify their demographics as part of an application to sit for the exam, but and this demographic data showed disparate outcomes, and certain identified demographic groups, Black, women, non-English speakers, and others, did not perform as well as other groups that existed. And so this brought a lot of scrutiny on the exam program, and here we are now. So what is happening in the world of social work? Legislators are reacting to this, and they're reacting to it in a manner that is, I would call, a knee-jerk reaction, and with a lack of understanding of exam development, validations, psychometrics, and differentiating between why there's an education component and an exam component in professional licensure of virtually all the professions. But what's happening now is legislation is being introduced to eliminate the exam as a prerequisite to licensure. So these are statutory potential changes that exist. And I am spending a lot of time assisting or testifying before legislatures or committees to address these important issues of having an understanding of legislature, what you're about to do, and the consequences of what you're about to do, and the undermining or lessening of credentials necessary to protect the public. And so these are interesting arguments, but this is what's going on, and in part, it's driven by the performance of the boards themselves and the effectiveness and efficiencies. So sunset review next. I think everybody knows what sunset review is, but it is statutory. It's something placed in the law that says every X number of years, boards will no longer exist unless they are affirmatively extended by legislative action. And in reading the Washington Sunset Statute, it uses performance measures and data collection as the basis for either sunsetting and no longer having a board or its continued existence. Now, we all would struggle with what is a performance measure? How are we going to decide that? And it's very difficult to substantiate. And boy, I sure have learned this over the last couple of years with the social work situation, is to justify the need for regulation as a whole let alone certain parts of regulation, education, exam, good moral character, whatever it is that you have. But how do you address these performance measures? Efficiencies, application completion up to licensure issuance, renewal completion up to renewal issuance, complaints and adjudications and how long those periods of time are. But where do we get the public protection side of it? That's the basis behind professional regulation. Very difficult. These standards that are in these sunset review processes, I think are a really challenging matter to overcome or to address or to meet come a sunset review process. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. But if anybody wants to put in the chat, are you subject to sunset review? That's good data for your for FSBP to have. And Jeff and Rich, I know you probably have some of this, but it's helpful to get some updates. So if you are subject to sunset review, maybe a yes or a no, or yes, subject to sunset review, so we can learn from each other, continue to learn from each other. In the state of Texas, sunset review across the board recommendations, those ATBs. So we see some Arizona, yes, and Stephen is from Kentucky every 7 years, yes. So you can see here is these across the board recommendations based on the legislature's sunset review criteria. These ATBs can apply consistent standards for open, responsive, and effective government across all state agencies. Learn to use those phrases and say them as often as you can and get them in the minutes of your board meetings so you can point to them as needed. So examples include, I'm still reading on the slide now, examples include ensuring public representation on governing boards, prohibiting conflicts of interest, and providing opportunities for public comments at agency board meetings. Those are just a few, right? And conflict of interest, why is that referenced? Perhaps we don't always see conflicts, but that's a due process question. Everybody understands that, right? And as part of due process, you need a fair and impartial decision-making body. And if you're conflicted, you're not fair. That's a very, very short version. So this is in the statute for sunset review in Texas, at least. Here's Colorado's. This is from their website. Sunrise. Okay, sunrise is should we regulate? Sunset is should we continue to regulate? And that they have a nice little chart here, there, and there's lots of words wrapped around these. So I encourage you to visit these sites and learn from each other as to how to address these situations, as if you all have all sorts of time, right? I'm making some assumptions, but take the time to do that. Maybe your staff can help you as well back in your jurisdictional boards. So sunset reports and audits, they are worth reading. Some are really, really well written, and some maybe aren't so well written, but they are worth reading because you're going to learn from each other and you're going to learn what's important. Now, in searching specific to physical therapy, I did find this 2021 California Sunset Review Report. And this is a long report, a long detailed report, and I would encourage everybody to read it. Okay. And it identifies strengths, it identifies weaknesses, it identifies surveys, it identifies satisfaction issues. It is very comprehensive, and I applaud California for this. And I also would suggest that we can all learn too from it. And even California may wish to, think, well, we can do better in 2025 or 2024. So Jason, I think I see you writing in here. So if you want to unmute and speak, Jason, you're from California, I believe. If you want to unmute and speak to this issue, if you were around in 2021, feel free to do that. If you don't want to, that's perfectly fine, but I'll give you a second in case I hear your voice come up.
You had me freaked out for a minute, Dale. Right? You throw my slide up on there. You don't really say whether it's a good example or a bad example. So I'm just like over here biting my nails.
No, it's a great example, Jason. It's a great example. And that's why I'm encouraging everybody to read it. So, and understand and learn from it as well. So, were you around?
Well, that's not always the case, because sometimes the stuff that I encourage others to do is to kind of like survey the minefield and see who stepped on what, right? So like I'll have them read bad reports too.
No, I like, well, you're right. I liked your report. Were you around during this? And you want to just tell everybody how difficult was it to put this together?
That's my third sunset report for this board. It's theoretically, it's based on about a 4 to 5 year term. Some boards have to go sooner than others because of performance issues or things that need to be looked at. sooner rather than later. We usually get the max extension, so we do pretty well. The legislature provides us a template with questions specific to address, and those questions tend to stay the same from one year to the next, with a few like trend exceptions. But it's a year-long process, right? The preparation of that report typically starts in about June for a hearing that we're going to have the following March or April. And that hearing goes before the legislature to defend that sunset report, whether we should be continued or not. Involves everybody, board members, all hands on deck. That year, we'll probably have 3 or 4 extra board meetings, in between our normally scheduled board meetings. But it is a labor of love and hate.
And I could certainly see that. And I want to emphasize and say, no, I like this report. I think it's worth reading and we can all learn from it. So thank you for those efforts. And whether you want to comment on this or not, Jason, but I might suggest to all the folks on the line today is if you're doing some of the things I'm about to suggest on a regular basis, these sunset reports become a little bit easier. Data's there, minutes are there. So
I can definitely speak to that. The distance between the sunset report that preceded this one and this one, we kind of designed that and baked that into our just quarterly board meeting materials, so that the sunset report itself kind of writes itself throughout the years. We're just pretty much collecting the data, putting it together, having to answer to some of those specific questions, but the data collection is consistent. The other part that we had an experience in 2016 with was the inconsistency of data, right? Like the reconciliation of records and those kind of things would show up as small discrepancies. Some interested parties would really focus in on those small discrepancies, but some of them are easy to explain and some of them not so much. So doing it this way was a lot easier.
Well done. And again, applause. And I will say for any of you, you can find this online. And so if you want to look through it, but you'll see surveys and other instruments in there that there's graphs and charts and everything else that shows some of the efficiencies and maybe some of the inefficiencies, but part of that is driven by staff issues as well, and staffing and budgets. So these are all used for the benefit of the future of your board, but it also can be used for your internal purposes as well, to better the situation. And related to that is if you gather that data at every board meeting, whether it's hits to the website, phone calls, applications, renewals, complaints, how many were, how many licenses issued, how many denied, how many remain pending, how long it took on average. Same thing with renewals, same thing with complaints. If you have that at your fingertips at every board meeting, these reports become a little bit easier perhaps to put together, do some surveys in between, and just take advantage of all that. So we've had topics on this we've had webinars on this same topic before, so I'm emphasizing it here, but feel free to read those and and look at this California report as well. So well done, and thank you for unmuting. So audits, again, they're not just financial, and they can be related to the legislature seeking information perhaps on a specific board itself, as well as all boards and otherwise, but it can be done through a resolution or otherwise. So it's not always an enacted statute. You may not even hear about it as a regulatory board until it shows up on your doorstep and you're asked to comply with these audits. Certainly what is within your control is the operational side of the board itself. Okay, and so efficiencies, how often you meet, how long they last, minutes, things I've already suggested there. But I might suggest while I'm on this topic, and it's somewhat repetitive from a previous webinar, but I'm going to say it again, and that is invite people to your board meeting. You want people at your board meeting. Invite legislators and the executive branch to your board meeting. Let them see you in action. Let them see how effective and efficient you are. But if you're going to do that, you better be effective and efficient. And your agenda and your presiding officer become really important as to how that meeting is run. But you want people to come to that board meeting. And if they don't show up, they, like say, selected legislators and or the executive branch or appointing authority, you send them an invite letter. Here's the agenda. Hope to see you there. You send them a follow-up letter after the meeting itself. We missed you. Sorry you weren't there. Here's a copy of our minutes once they've been approved, by the way. One, and two is if they're well-written minutes, and that's a topic in and of itself. But executive branch, we missed you. Here's a copy of our minutes. We know what we're doing. Look forward to seeing you at the next meeting. And if you get into that habit, I think again, these audits and or sunset review reports can become a little bit more, a little bit easier and less taxing on your staff during that year period that Jason just talked about, or perhaps even more than a year that might exist. Obviously, financial statements or financial performance can be extremely important, especially if the funds are appropriated through a legislative process as opposed to the standalone boards that might collect your fees and operate and create a contribution to the general fund of certain amounts, but you're in much more control. So financial issues, and then anything else that you all can think of that that do exist out there. So I said this earlier, and I'll say it again now, and that is always be prepared for this review, for the scrutiny, always, and invite the review and the scrutiny. You should be proud of what it is you do and not fearful of this kind of oversight. Now, I don't want to sound too naive because politics are politics, or is it politics is politics, but we understand that that some of these things may be out of your control and otherwise, but you need to do what's within your control as a regulatory board itself. So, but always be prepared for it. And I've already mentioned, invite people, have them there, welcome the scrutiny. Maybe if the media shows up at your board meeting, they write a positive article about volunteerism. As I mentioned, I have lots of FSBPT-like clients, and I'm surrounded by volunteerism, and it is absolutely inspiring. You all volunteer at the state, level back in your home jurisdiction. Some of you volunteer for committees of FSBPT. Some of you run for the board of directors of FSBPT, and it is absolutely inspiring what you do for public protection, the ultimate, and the regulation of the professions itself. So invite the scrutiny, welcome it in, be proud of it, and as Colin Powell said, somebody's watching you all the time, so you could be aware of that as well. The last two things that I will reference here, these are not necessarily technically sunset reports, but these are audits. And so this is from December of 2024, the state of Arizona, special audit of the Arizona State Board of Chiropractic Examiners. Read this one and learn from it. And California and Jason, I applaud you for what you do and what you did and the reports and everything, which I think are positive outcomes. This report is not necessarily as flattering about. And by the way, this is an outside audit looking at the board. It's not the board telling the legislature we're really good at this stuff. It's an outside entity looking at the board and identifying some of these inefficiencies and some of the lack of compliance with maybe the legal requirements of the board itself. So December 2024, an Arizona audit, feel free to browse that. You can find this online if you look for it. But this is an example of a legislative resolution that said, let's do an audit on this board because we're getting complaints and we're not sure exactly what this board is effective and efficient at, and perhaps not as effective and efficient. So this is a report maybe worth reading. And then out of Illinois, there's this comprehensive licensing information to minimize barriers, task force, climb, a little bit of a different report, but it sheds light on the regulatory process, but it focuses on barriers to licensure. And the reason I think this report is important to you all and this topic is the more we understand what are perceived as barriers, the better off we will be, you, the regulatory community, will be better off at addressing these big picture issues. So a couple of reports there, both the Arizona specific to the chiropractic board, and then this climb report, also December, by the way, or it says November, I think, right? Yeah, I think it was actually released in December, but November of 2024, both very current, eye-opening as to the legislature's view of what may be perceived as unnecessary barriers to licensure. And that is a big issue across the professions. Is entry to practice and what may or may not be necessary to ultimately protect the public. Very hard question to answer, especially, it's difficult to identify some of these benefits that exist there and certainly to articulate them. So there's so much to be learned from all of these reports, and whether it's physical therapy specific, or whether it's related to in general regulation or other boards specifically, we can all learn from those. And so I wanted to at least present a couple of examples that exist and that are there. So does anybody have any comments, questions, anything you want to say about about what's going on in your jurisdictions related to this topic, audit, sunset, whatever it might be, or tips that might help your fellow attendees here and your fellow regulators? And feel free to unmute or raise your hand or type it in the chat there as well. Stephen, if it's silent, I will turn it over to you. Excuse me, turn it over to you, but I want to end my remarks. So North Carolina, go ahead. You have a question?
Yeah, this is Kathy Arney from North Carolina. I wondered if you had seen, or well, not really seen, but maybe heard the podcast on Freakonomics Radio about whether licensing is a racket. And her name is Andrea, and I want to say Duckworth, but it's not Duckworth. I can't remember exactly what it is, but it paints a really, in my opinion, negative picture of licensure boards, and her information to me is based on her attending regulatory board meetings in Tennessee for about a year, but yet it's this broad sweeping commentary. So to me, it's kind of an audit of licensing boards based on maybe a legal journalist's opinion. And I wondered if you had heard it and whether you had any comments about any of that.
Well, I know Rebecca, who, and I'm not surprised by her position. She's a professor, as I recall, at what's the school in Nashville? The law school in Nashville. Anyway, she is in Tennessee. So
Vanderbilt.
Yeah, Vanderbilt. Thank you. I have not heard that, but thank you for bringing it to everybody's attention, including mine, because we need to hear this side of things in order to, as a regulatory community, be better at addressing the issues that surface. And we should welcome some of this criticism. Rebecca and I have actually done some debating on stage in front of regulators, and and so, but she's all over these issues. But thank you for bringing that to our attention. So I'm going to look up that podcast as well. Do you know what year it was? How old it is?
It just came out like 2 weeks ago.
Okay, excellent. So I will listen to that, and everybody else who's got the time and you're able to, maybe you can chime in as well, but let's learn from it. Let's learn from it.
Thanks.
And thank you for bringing that to our attention. Other questions or comments? So again, if it's quiet, Stephen, I'll turn it back to you, but I will end as I began, and that is a big shout out, thanks, FSBPT board, staff, giant thanks to each and every one of you for what you do. I hope this information is helpful, stimulating to you. And boy, if you can come up with ideas and be like California or do reports or whatever it takes, feel free to share those, and you all benefit. And by the way, that's part of why FSBPT exists, is to facilitate those kinds of communications and discussions. So I do look forward to seeing everybody in, is it March, Rich, whenever the regulatory workshop is. And so thank you, Stephen. I'll turn it back to you, and appreciate everybody's attendance.
Thank you, Dale. Thank you all for your time. Just as a reminder, for administrators and staff, if you haven't registered already, go over and register for that CBA webinar coming up. And remember to keep an eye out for the details for the March 6th communication or the webinar relating to communication. And then join us again in April for another regulatory hour with Dale. Other than that, thank you.